The winter storms of the high Rockies had a way of swallowing sound itself. In the deep months of 1836, when the wind screamed across the ridgelines and the snow climbed the cabin walls like a living thing, even the strongest men in the valley rose each morning with a thin crust of ice on their blankets. Trees split under their own frozen sap. Horses died in their stalls. Trappers who'd seen 20 hard winters said this one felt different, sharper somehow, like the cold carried intent. Most frontier cabins could barely hold heat for more than an hour after the fire died. A man could sit directly beside the hearth boots, nearly smoking, and still feel the draft creeping around his ankles. Firewood disappeared faster than men could cut it. And in this remote basin, far from any trading post running out of wood, didn't just mean discomfort. It meant risk, real bone-deep risk. But amid that brutal season, rumors began to spread of a cabin unlike the others. A warm cabin. A cabin where frost never formed on the logs inside. A cabin where a man could wake at dawn and breathe without seeing his own breath hang in the air. Folks said the heat inside held through the night even after the fire died down to nothing but soft, red coals. They said the man who built it, Elias Turner, a quiet mountain wanderer with winter in his eyes, had done something strange. Foolish, according to most. Dangerous, according to others. He'd built thicker walls than any homesteader would bother with. Reinforced his floor like he meant to store oxen indoors. And the strangest rumor of all, he had somehow filled parts of his cabin walls with water. When other men first heard it, they burst out laughing. Water inside a frontier cabin in January. It was madness. Water freezes. Water swells. Water splits timber. Any child knew that. More than one neighbor predicted the entire structure would burst apart before December ended. Some joked that Elias would be found frozen solid inside, entombed in his own foolish experiment. But the laughter faded as the temperature dropped. Because while the rest of the valley fought the cold tooth and nail, something impossible was happening. Elias's cabin stayed warm. Not lukewarm, not survivable warm. Warm enough for him to sleep without his heavy coat. Warm enough for him to burn a fraction of the wood everyone else tore through. Warm enough that smoke rarely curled from his chimney. In a land where comfort was a luxury and warmth a matter of life and death. One question spread faster than the snowdrifts. How in God's name did one mountain man build a cabin that stayed 29 degrees warmer than everyone else's? This is that story. A story of observation over tradition, of quiet genius, hidden behind a frost-rimed beard, and of a man who refused to accept that winter should rule his life. A story born in a forgotten corner of the Rockies where survival wasn't just about grit, it was about understanding the world more deeply than the world understood itself. And it all began long before the first snow fell. Long before Elias Turner became the man folks whispered about. He had already lived enough winters to understand cold in ways few men ever would. Born to Scandinavian immigrants in Ohio, he spent his youth apprenticing under a wheelwright who believed every piece of wood had a temperament. Heat teaches you more than books do, the old craftsman used to say. And Elias listened. He watched how wooden rims expanded when soaked, how iron shrank when quenched, how a wagon wheel left in the sun held warmth hours after dusk. Those small observations planted something in him, a way of seeing heat as a thing that could be stored, shaped, even persuaded. In his 20s, he drifted west and worked as a winter carpenter for mining outfits in Missouri and the Dakota frontier. He noticed how ice thinned slowly on thick beams, but cracked quickly on thin boards. He learned how earth-walled bunkhouses stayed warmer than log cabins with open seams. Each winter taught him another quiet truth about how heat behaved when trapped, slowed, or given mass to cling to. But the turning point came during the winter of '32. A storm pinned him inside a drafty trapper's shack in the Black Hills. For 3 nights, he nearly froze, even with a fire burning full. The cabin bled heat so fast that he spent the nights awake feeding the stove until his hands blistered. On the 4th night, exhausted and half delirious, he pressed his back against a stack of heavy water casks stored along one wall. To his shock, the wood felt warm hours after the fire had begun to fade. Those barrels sitting silently in the dark were radiating heat back into the room. Elias didn't forget it. He couldn't. That moment, barely noticed by anyone else, latched onto him like a burr on buckskin. He spent the following winters paying attention to every place: heat-lingered rocks beside a fire pit, thick logs near the stove, even the deeper water of partially frozen creeks. Everywhere he looked, he saw one truth: repeated heavy things held warmth long after the source faded. When he finally came to the northern Rockies in '36, he carried not just his tools and traps, but an idea that had been simmering inside him for years. He would build a cabin that didn't fight winter. It used winter's own rules against it. But first he had to survive the valley's opinions. The first time Elias mentioned his cabin design to the neighbors, they reacted as if he'd announced he meant to sleep in the river. Men in the frontier were practical to the bone, and anything that smelled of theory, especially from a quiet outsider, was met with suspicion. When he told them he intended to put water inside his walls, their eyes widened in genuine disbelief. Water-old Red McCarthy barked. "Inside a cabin in winter, that's suicide," another man muttered. "Water freezes faster than a widow remarries." To them, water was something you hauled boiled or prayed wouldn't leak into your supplies. It wasn't a building material. And it certainly wasn't something you trapped inside timbers on purpose. Elias tried to explain calmly and patiently how heat traveled, how thick mass cooled slowly, how sunlight could be captured even in winter if given the right vessel. But frontier men valued experience over explanation, repetition over experimentation. If their fathers didn't do it, and their fathers before them didn't do it, then it wasn't something worth doing. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Elias had taken a bad fall trapping and scrambled his senses. Others insisted he'd frozen a little too hard one winter, and the cold had seeped into his thinking. One man joked he was building a wooden boat turned inside out, which earned several chuckles around the settlement. What none of them understood, because none bothered to, was that Elias wasn't guessing. He wasn't experimenting out of boredom or arrogance. He was following a chain of observations collected across 20 winters, across thousands of small moments, when heat behaved differently than men assumed it did. But on the frontier, mockery traveled fast and understanding traveled slow. By the time he began cutting the first timbers for his cabin, most men in the valley had already decided the outcome: Elias Turner would freeze and freeze badly. The only debate was whether his strange cabin would collapse before or after the first serious snowstorm. Yet every insult, every sideways look only strengthened his resolve. Let them laugh. Let them doubt. Winter was the judge here, and winter didn't care about opinions. Elias built not for their approval, but for survival. Elias began building in late summer, when the air still held warmth, but the first hints of the coming winter whispered through the aspen leaves. Most men in the valley threw up cabins in a week or two, 4 walls, a roof, a hole for smoke. But Elias worked with a patience that made his neighbors uneasy. Every timber he selected had a reason. Every joint was cut as if he meant the cabin to stand a century. The first thing he built was the floor, not the walls, not the chimney. The floor. Because he knew what no one else did. It would carry the weight of nearly 2 tons of water. He dug trenches deeper than the frost line, filling them with layered stone that locked together like a dry well. Over this, he placed thick support beams, hewn from slow-grown spruce, each one white as a man's palm and heavy as a small anvil. The joists were spaced tighter than normal, so the structure could carry the vertical water columns he planned. Farmers walking past shook their heads. He's building a barn floor for a one-room cabin. When the foundation was done, Elias turned to the walls. Instead of the usual single log thickness, he constructed a double-walled structure, inner and outer log layers, with a full foot of open space between them. Into that gap, he packed sawdust, dried moss, and shredded bark, tamping the mixture until it felt firm and dense. This insulation, unheard of in most cabins, made the walls nearly 3 feet thick. Some men laughed outright when they saw it. "You planning to stop cannon fire?" one asked. Elias just kept tamping the insulation. Next came the feature that puzzled the valley most, the vertical frames built into the south wall. Each frame was box-like, braced with crossbeams and sealed with pitch. No one knew their purpose, but they sensed it had something to do with his water foolishness, and that alone made them suspicious. A few men stopped by just to stare and mutter. Elias ignored them. He designed these wall cavities specifically to capture the low winter sun. By placing them on the south wall and building narrow vertical slots for sunlight to enter, he created what he called sun columns, water-filled channels that would warm even on freezing days. The engineering was subtle, invisible to anyone not looking closely. The angle of the openings, the darkened wood inside the frame, the placement between support beams for maximum radiant release after sunset. Above the roof became an engineering marvel of its own. Instead of a simple plank layer, Elias built 2 tiers with packed earth and sod between them, creating a natural insulator that trapped rising heat. The roof rested on thick, overbuilt rafters, meant not only to withstand snow load, but also to prevent heat loss along the ridge. Inside, the ceiling felt lower and more intimate than the typical frontier cabin. A choice he made deliberately: less air to warm, less heat wasted. By the time the structure stood complete, it looked less like a frontier shelter and more like something carved out of necessity and stubborn intelligence. Every seam was tight. Every log was hand-fitted to its neighbor. No drafts whispered at the corners. No gaps in the chinking allowed winter to pry its way inside. Neighbors stopped calling it a cabin. They called it a bunker of folly, or sometimes simply Turner's mistake. One man swore the whole thing would collapse when the first thaw swelled the water inside. Another said Elias was building a giant icebox that would kill him quicker than a weak fire. But Elias didn't build for their understanding. He built for the cold he knew was coming, the kind of cold that stole strength from a man's bones and turned breath into crystals. When he finally stepped back to look at the finished shell, sweat drying on his brow and tools hanging from his belt, he felt no pride, only readiness. The walls were thick, the foundation strong, the sunward frame secure. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Next came the part that would push the valley's patience and his reputation past its breaking point. When the cabin shell finally stood solid against the rising winds of early autumn, Elias began the part of his design that no one in the valley could make sense of, not even the men who prided themselves on minding everyone else's business. They expected him to drag in a few barrels, maybe stack them along the hearth like a misguided scholar. But Elias had no intention of cluttering his floor with round casks or fighting their bulk. Instead, he built the water into the cabin itself. He began with the south wall. Using the vertical frames he had installed earlier, he lined each cavity with darkened planks, staining them with soot, so they would drink up every ray of winter sunlight. Then he sealed the joints with a mixture of pine pitch bear fat and boiled linseed oil, an old wheelwright's trick for waterproofing seams. One cavity at a time, he created tall, narrow chambers, each capable of holding more than a man could lift in one haul. Neighbors gathered outside, arms crossed, whispering among themselves. "There he goes, ruining a perfectly good wall," someone said. A man shouldn't build things he can't explain in a word or two. Another muttered, "That whole south wall will pop like a tick when the water freezes." Elias didn't answer. He kept working, checking each joint with his fingertips, tapping the frames for resonance the way a cooper tested a barrel. The vertical chambers were only the beginning. Near the hearth, he built 2 horizontal troughs into the wall, long and broad, positioned so that heat from the fire would soak directly through their timber facings. These weren't meant for holding supplies. They were thermal reservoirs, heat sinks that would charge each morning and release warmth deep into the night. But the design most frontier men couldn't comprehend was the bench. Along the east side of the cabin, Elias constructed what looked like a simple sitting bench, thick timber top, smoothed with a draw knife, wide enough for a man to rest after a long day. But beneath the bench seat was a sealed water chamber, stretching nearly the full length of the wall. It acted as both furniture and furnace, soaking in radiant heat when the fire was high and giving it back in a slow, steady breath as the cabin cooled. To ordinary eyes, it looked like nothing more than clever carpentry. To Elias, it was the heart of the system, the quiet backbone that would keep him warm even when the sun failed and the fire dwindled to a memory. By late September, the interior of the cabin was crisscrossed with hidden reservoirs, 4 tall, sun-heated water columns, 2 horizontal fire-fed troughs, and a full-length thermal bench. Together, they held more water than 6 large barrels, without wasting a single inch of floor space and without compromising the structural strength of the cabin. But the most subtle detail of all lay beneath the floorboards. Elias had carved narrow, stone-lined channels running under the planks, designed to guide warm air from the hearth downward and along the base of the wall reservoirs. As the warm air drifted, it kissed the water chambers from below, adding another layer of charging before slipping out through a vent at the far end of the room. A primitive heat circulation system, simple, silent, and perfectly tuned to the cabin's shape. By the time the last chamber was sealed, the neighbors had run out of jokes. Some still laughed, but the laughter carried an edge, now uncertainty, maybe even a hint of worry. Elias had built something none of them understood, something that looked neither like a winter folly nor a sane man's work. Whether it was genius or madness, no one could yet say, but winter would. By October, the aspens had turned to gold, and the mornings carried the brittle edge of frost. This was the moment Elias had been preparing for, the step that would finally reveal the purpose of all those chambers hidden in the walls. Most men hauled firewood during those weeks. Elias hauled water. Each morning before the sun crested the ridge, he walked to the creek with 2 yokes and a stack of wooden buckets. The water was already cold enough to sting his fingers, and a thin skim of ice formed along the edges where shadows lay longest. He filled bucket after bucket, carrying them back to the cabin, emptying them into the vertical sun columns first. The water glugged down the narrow shafts with a sound unlike anything the frontier had heard, a slow, deep swallowing that echoed faintly inside the timber. When the first column filled, Elias tapped its sides, listening for the solid, weighted thump that told him the chamber was full and the seams were tight. Then he moved to the next, and the next. Neighbors who happened to pass stopped dead in their tracks. A few leaned on their sleds and stared, blinking in disbelief. "He's truly doing it," one whispered. "That wall's gonna explode when the cold sets in." Another added, "If he lives to Christmas, I'll eat my hat." Elias paid no mind. He left an expansion gap at the top of each chamber 2 fingers width, calculated from years of watching barrels swell in winter storage. He sealed each opening with a pitch-coated plank, tapping it gently until it seated perfectly against the frame. Then he smeared the joint with a mixture of fat ash and powdered charcoal to prevent evaporation. The hearth troughs came next. Those filled more slowly, requiring careful pouring so air pockets wouldn't form. The bench took 2 days on its own, its hidden chambers swallowing water with a slow patience that matched Elias's own. By week's end, his cabin held more than 1,000 pounds of water, locked behind its walls, dark, silent, massive. To the untrained eye, it looked no different than before. To Elias, the cabin felt heavier, steadier underfoot, as if the place had taken its first breath and settled into its true purpose. When the final chamber was sealed, a group of skeptical neighbors drifted over, pretending they were just out for a walk. They circled the cabin, tapping the walls with their knuckles, listening for hollows or leaks. They expected drips, cracks, disaster. But the walls held. No swell, no ruptures, no signs of weakness. One man shook his head. All that water, just sitting in there waiting to freeze. It'll be the death of him. Maybe or maybe not. Because while the men of the valley saw a wall full of trouble, Elias saw something else entirely. A battery, a reservoir of stored warmth, a winter-long promise waiting to be kept. And the moment the first hard freeze arrived, the valley would finally learn what he'd been building toward all along. The first real cold snap came earlier than anyone expected. One evening in mid-November, a gray wall of cloud slid over the ridgeline like a slow-moving tide. By nightfall, the wind rose to a low roar, bending the pine tops and driving needles of ice into the valley. The temperature fell so fast, the creek froze at its edges before midnight. By morning, every cabin in the basin groaned under the weight of a sudden, brutal freeze. Most men woke shivering breath hanging in the air like fog. Fires had burned full through the night, yet frost still gathered on the inside of thin cabin walls. Children cried from the cold, and men cursed the storm as they stumbled outside to split more wood. Winter had announced itself with a blow meant to test the living. But in Elias Turner's cabin, something else was happening. He had risen before dawn, as was his habit, and fed only a modest fire, one armful of split spruce, no more. Flames licked the hearthstones, warming the room enough to chase away the chill. More importantly, the heat seeped into the troughs near the fireplace, warming the water sealed behind the timber. As the sun climbed, pale but determined rays filtered through the south-facing slots and struck the vertical water columns. Even in freezing air, the darkened chambers drank in the light. By midday, the cabin felt steady cooler than summer, but far from cold. Elias moved quietly inside, sharpening tools, checking his traps, letting the fire die to embers. Outside, the wind screamed against the double walls. Inside, the air held still thick with the quiet warmth that rose from the hidden reservoirs. When night came, most cabins in the valley began cooling the moment their fires dimmed. Heat fled through chink gaps and roof seams, slipping away into the dark. But Elias sat on his water-filled bench hands, resting against the timber, feeling the warmth pulse back into the room. It wasn't hot. It didn't need to be. It was steady and even slow breath that wrapped the air in a blanket thick enough to hold off the worst of the cold. By midnight, while neighbors fed their fires desperately, Elias slept under a single wool blanket. The storm howled outside, pushing snow against his walls, rattling branches against the roof. But inside, the temperature hardly budged. The water columns charged with heat from the morning fire, and the afternoon sunlight released their stored energy with the patience of stone cliffs, holding the day's warmth after sunset. When dawn finally broke, Elias rose and touched the wall beside the bench. The timber was warm, not hot warm. A deep, gentle warmth that shouldn't have existed in a cabin without a fire burning through the night. He lit the stove again, only because he enjoyed the ritual, not because he needed it. Later that day, Samuel Brigg trudged through knee-deep snow to check on him. Brigg expected to find the place rimed with frost, perhaps even abandoned. Instead, Elias opened the door in shirt sleeves, a thin trail of warm air drifting out like a welcome. Brigg stepped inside and stopped dead. The room held a calm, steady heat, warmer than any cabin he'd been in since autumn. No fire roared, no stove blazed. Only a small coal bed glowed faintly in the hearth. He touched the wall. Warm. He touched the bench. Warmer still. "It don't make sense," he muttered. "Cold as a widow's heart outside, and your cabin's sittin' in spring." Elias only shrugged. Water remembers warmth longer than a man thinks. But Brigg understood, at least partly. His eyes swept the room, taking in the thick walls, the sealed chambers, the strange frames along the south side. He'd mocked Elias before. Everyone had. But now he saw something he couldn't deny. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was engineering. The storm outside raged for 2 more days. Most men burned through half a cord of wood in that time. Elias used barely an armload. Winter had judged his design and found it sound. To the men of the frontier, heat was simple fire, made it cold, stole it. That was the extent of their understanding. But Elias saw heat differently, less like a flame and more like a substance, something that could be collected, stored, and released on command. To him, warmth behaved like water in a vessel spreading slowly, rising, falling, lingering. And the cabin he built was designed not just to trap heat, but to bank it. The secret was in 3 principles. Frontiermen rarely considered thermal mass insulation and directional gain. 1. Thermal mass. Why heavy things stay warm longer. Water pound for pound can store more heat than almost any natural material a settler had access to. Wood, stone, clay, none come close. If you warmed a stone in a bucket of water to the same temperature, the stone would cool in an hour or 2. The water would stay warm for half a day or more. This was the heart of Elias's design. Each water chamber inside his walls acted like a reservoir of heat. When the fire burned or the sun shone, energy seeped into the water. Once captured, that heat didn't vanish quickly. It lingered hours, sometimes the entire night, leaking slowly back into the cabin in a soft, even flow. Frontier cabins failed, not because they lacked fire, but because they lacked mass. Thin log walls, uninsulated roofs, empty air with nothing to hold. Warmth heat simply rushed outward the moment the flames died. Elias replaced that emptiness with weight. The heavier the structure, the slower the temperature changed. It was the difference between warming a feather and warming a river stone. 2. Why vertical water columns outperformed barrels. Most men thought of storing water in barrels a reasonable idea, but flawed. Barrels required floor space, risked freezing at the edges, and created uneven heating. Vertical columns solved these problems elegantly. They absorbed sunlight through tall, narrow slots, warming the water from top to bottom. Their shape minimized surface area, exposed to cold timber, reducing heat loss. And because they were built into the structure itself, the warm water radiated evenly through the thick walls. Better still, while the sunlight penetrating those narrow slots struck soot-darkened interiors designed to maximize absorption. Dark surfaces heated faster, stayed warm longer, and transferred that warmth into the water more efficiently. Elias had essentially created passive solar heaters, primitive but highly effective. 3. Hearth troughs and the thermal bench. Fire presents its heat quickly, wastefully. Most of it races up the chimney or pools uselessly near the ceiling. Elias redirected it. By placing water-filled troughs on each side of the hearth, he created sinks that grabbed some of that runaway warmth and saved it for later. The bench worked similarly. As he sat sharpening tools or cleaning traps, his body heat alone warmed the timber, which in turn warmed the water below it. Not enough to heat the room on its own, but enough to contribute to the slow, steady temperature balance he aimed for. 4. Insulation, the guardian of stored heat. Thermal mass meant nothing without insulation. That was the frontier's fatal flaw. A typical cabin wall lost heat the way a cracked barrel lost water, fast and relentlessly. But Elias's double wall system stuffed with sawdust, moss, and shredded bark created an R-value unheard of at the time. His walls were nearly 3 feet thick. His roof was a double sod design, more common in Scandinavian farmhouses than Rocky Mountain cabins. Where most cabins leaked warmth like a sieve, Elias's leaked like a stone cellar, slow and grudging. 5. Directional gain. The power of facing south. Most frontier cabins were built wherever the ground was flat, and orientation was an afterthought. Not for Elias. He built his cabin with purpose. South-facing windows to catch winter sun. South-facing water columns to convert that sunlight into stored heat. North and west walls thickened even further to block the brutal winds. His cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a collector, an early accidental form of passive solar design, long before the phrase existed. 6. Why his neighbors failed when they copied him. Once word spread, several men tried to imitate Elias's system. Most failed spectacularly. Not because the idea was flawed, but because they misunderstood the principles. They used too little water, or they placed barrels in dark corners, or they left gaps in their walls, or they ignored insulation entirely. One man placed barrels in front of a north-facing wall, never realizing they would never absorb enough heat to matter. Another stuffed old blankets around his barrels, thinking it would help when in fact it smothered their ability to radiate warmth back into the room. Elias didn't use magic. He used physics. 7. The perfect combination. What made his system so powerful was not any single feature. Not the walls, not the water, not the insulation, not the bench, not the sun columns. It was all of them integrated like pieces of a single machine. Fire heated the troughs. Sunlight charged the columns. The insulated walls protected the stored heat. The thermal bench moderated the room temperature. And the entire structure worked in harmony, smoothing out the violent swings of the Rocky Mountain nights. To a frontier man, it looked like sorcery. To Elias, it was simple. Heat is a traveler, he often said quietly. Give it a home and it stays. Winter had given him its harshest test. Science had given him the tools to pass it. As December settled over the valley, winter showed its true teeth. Nights plunged to 10 below zero. In the dim hours before dawn, smoke rose from every chimney in the basin, thin, frantic, constant. Men staggered through deep drifts to their woodpiles, boots crusted with ice arms, aching from splitting logs just to keep the cold from crawling into their bones. Children slept with mittens. Water buckets froze solid by morning. Even the stoutest cabins seemed to tremble under the relentless push of the wind. But Elias Turner's cabin told a different story. Each day began the same, a small fire at dawn, just enough to warm the troughs near the hearth and stir the air inside the room. After 3 or 4 hours, the fire died down naturally. Elias didn't ration wood out of fear, he simply didn't need more. While other men fed their stoves constantly, he spent the late mornings mending gear, checking his trap lines, or sitting quietly at his workbench, listening to the muted thrum of wind against the thick walls. Inside his home, the air held steady. Not hot, never hot, but comfortably warm, improbably warm. The water columns along the south wall glowed softly with absorbed sunlight, their stored heat seeping through the timber like a heartbeat. By evening, when the valley's fires blazed highest in desperation, Elias's cabin required nothing more than the lingering warmth of its reservoirs. Some nights he lit no fire at all. He began waking each morning to the same remarkable reality. Frost gathered outside thick as wool on branches and roof lines, yet his cabin hovered near 60 degrees. No icy breath, no frozen boots, no scramble to relight a fire before his fingers stiffened. Just a quiet, steady comfort that felt almost like cheating nature. Neighbors noticed. At first, it was just glimpses, seeing thin smoke from his chimney for only a short time each morning. Then whispers spread Turner's barely burning wood. Man's cabin ain't freezing at night. He's using a quarter what we're using. To frontier families who spent half their waking hours tending a fire, it sounded impossible. But impossibility didn't matter. What mattered was that somehow the cold wasn't winning inside that cabin. While others burned a cord of wood every 10 days, Elias used a cord every month, sometimes less. Men who once mocked him now eyed their shrinking wood piles with dread, wondering what exactly he had built into those strange walls. A few swallowed their pride and visited, stepping reluctantly through his door, expecting to find him huddled in blankets. Instead, they found him working with bare hands, coat hung loosely on a peg, air warm enough to ease the tightness in their lungs. It wasn't just a warm cabin. It was a warm winter, something frontier families rarely experienced. For the first time in many years, Elias felt the season pass not as a threat, but as a companion, harsh, yes, but no longer in control of his fate. His cabin had become a sanctuary against a landscape that respected nothing but those who outsmarted it, and word of that sanctuary was spreading fast. The turning point came on a brittle January afternoon when Samuel Brigg, the valley's toughest, most weather-beaten trapper, finally swallowed his pride and trudged through the drifts toward Elias's cabin. Brigg wasn't the type to admit curiosity. He'd mocked Elias louder than most men, calling the water-filled walls Turner's folly and predicting they'd burst before the first real freeze. But winter had a way of humbling even the proudest. Brigg's woodpile was shrinking fast. His children slept in layers of blankets, and still he woke to frost on their lashes. Every morning he hacked at frozen logs with numb hands, cursing the cold, the snow, the valley, and more than once the man who somehow wasn't suffering. When he reached Elias's door, he stood for a full minute before knocking, as if admitting defeat required preparation. The door opened to a gentle wave of warm air. Elias stood inside, sleeves rolled calm as a man in late spring. "Afternoon, Samuel," Elias said, as if he'd expected him. "Come in before you freeze." Briggs stepped through and froze in place. The cabin didn't just feel warmer than his own. It felt steady, like the air held its temperature out of sheer confidence. No roaring fire, no frantic crackling. Just a quiet warmth that wrapped around him like a heavy quilt. Briggs placed his palm against the wall. Warm. He touched the bench. Warmer. His brows knit not in skepticism now, but in awe. "How?" he whispered. Elias didn't smirk or gloat. He simply gestured toward the south wall where the hidden columns rested behind the timber. "Water remembers heat better than wood does. Better than stone, even." Briggs looked at him. Really looked as if seeing the man for the first time. The mockery that once colored his voice was gone. In its place lay something quieter respect and maybe a little regret. "I thought you were crazy," he admitted. "Most folks did," Elias replied. Briggs nodded, rubbing his hands near the faintly warm trough beside the hearth. "Well, I reckon most folks were wrong." Outside, the cold wind clawed at the corners of the cabin. But in that moment, inside those thick, water-laden walls, a shift happened. A valley that once laughed had begun to listen, and for the first time since early autumn, Elias wasn't alone in his understanding. Once Samuel Briggs left Elias's cabin that January afternoon, he didn't walk home, he hurried. Word spread faster than the wind that evening. Turner's cabin isn't just warm, it stays warm. By the next day, 2 more men trudged over, pretending they were just passing by, only to step inside and fall silent at the gentle heat that wrapped around them. Curiosity that began as mockery transformed into something sharper need. The valley had already burned through far more wood than expected. Some families were staring at half-empty piles with 2 months of winter left. And while Elias fed only a small fire each morning, others were arriving at the brink of exhaustion. Soon, settlers began asking quietly at first how he'd done it. Elias, never one to hoard knowledge, fetched a sheet of birch bark from a shelf and began sketching. Thick walls, packed sawdust, water columns facing south, hearth troughs tied into the structure. A cabin, he explained, wasn't just a shelter. It was a heat engine. Every log, every seam, every chamber had to work together. A few men tried building their own systems. Some did well. James Rowley added 3 small water columns beside his fireplace and saw his cabin hold heat longer than ever before. Another settler built a crude thermal bench inspired by Elias's design and slept through an entire night without tending the stove, something he said hadn't happened in 20 years. But not everyone succeeded. One family placed water barrels against the north wall, never realizing that no winter sun would ever reach them. The barrels froze solid, cracked and dumped water across the floor. Another lined his water chambers with blankets, thinking insulation would help. But instead, he trapped the heat inside the water, preventing it from radiating outward. He blamed Elias for a broken idea, though the mistake had been his own. Frontier innovations rarely spread cleanly. He stumbled forward in fits and starts, shaped by the skills, stubbornness, and misunderstandings of the people adopting them. Yet the idea kept growing. By February, 6 cabins experimented with some form of thermal mass. They varied wildly. Some used stacked stone, others clay pots filled with water. One man even buried small vessels in the floor near his stove. Some versions failed spectacularly. Others worked surprisingly well. But one truth became clear: the valley's attitude had changed. Where once they laughed at Elias's water walls, they now asked for advice. Where once they mocked, they now listened. Through patience, results, and the undeniable bite of winter, Elias had done something rare on the frontier. He'd introduced a new idea, and it had taken root. As winter wore on and the valley slowly stopped laughing, Elias Turner found himself in a strange position. He hadn't built the warmest cabin for glory. He hadn't engineered his way through the cold for admiration. He had done it because he'd lived enough winters to understand one simple truth: survival rewards thoughtfulness more than strength. But the frontier wasn't a place where men spoke freely of ideas. They spoke of weather and game trails and the stubbornness of mules. So Elias kept most of his philosophy tucked quietly behind his frost-edged beard, revealing it only in small pieces to those who asked genuinely, not out of curiosity, but out of need. He believed winter was not the enemy. Winter was a teacher. A relentless one, yes, but a fair one. Winter punished carelessness and rewarded observation. He often told the men who visited him, "Cold ain't out to kill you. It just don't care whether you live." To Elias, that neutrality was liberating. Winter didn't target the weak, it simply exposed the unprepared. And so his cabin became more than a shelter. It became a testament to the way he saw the world. He believed everything in nature spoke a quiet language, and a man's job was to listen. How creek water stayed warmer at depth. How river stones radiated warmth long after sunset. How earth walls in Dakota bunkhouses held heat better than rushed log cabins. How frost melted unevenly across barns, revealing where warmth lingered and where it escaped. These small observations, collected over 2 decades, shaped the system he built. He didn't invent a miracle. He merely noticed what others overlooked. Yet Elias also understood something deeper, something the valley rarely considered. Comfort isn't weakness. Comfort is efficiency. If a man spent all day splitting wood to feed a hungry stove, he had no strength left for hunting repairing gear or tending to his family. If a cabin stole heat the moment a fire died, it stole time and labor with equal ruthlessness. To Elias, a warm cabin wasn't a luxury. It was a tool that gave a man his life back. During long evenings, when the fire had burned to a soft glow, he would sit on the thermal bench he'd built and think about all the winters he had endured. The freezing nights in crude bunkhouses, The weeks he slept half awake, tending fires to stay alive. The exhaustion that made men careless with axes and careless with judgment. His new cabin felt like a quiet rebellion against all that proof that frontier life didn't have to be a constant battle. Sometimes, when a neighbor visited and stood in awe of the warm walls, Elias would say softly, "A man's work should make life easier, not harder. Otherwise, what's the point?" He didn't preach. He didn't boast. He simply lived the truth he had discovered. Innovation wasn't fancy. It wasn't loud. It wasn't prideful. It was noticing what others missed, understanding it, and shaping it into something useful. In a valley where strength was measured by the size of a man's woodpile and the toughness of his hands, Elias Turner quietly showed that sometimes the sharpest tool a man could carry into winter was his mind. When spring finally loosened winter's grip on the valley, Elias's cabin stood as solid and quiet as the day he'd first sealed its walls. Snow retreated from the eaves. The creek thawed and ran clear again. Geese cut long, wavering lines across the sky. And bit by bit, life returned to the settlement. But Elias's work had already left its mark. Long after the Snowmelt Valley families continued talking about his water-filled walls. Not in mockery now, but in a tone usually reserved for things half-remembered from old country wisdom. A few men rebuilt sections of their cabins. Others copied his stove trough design. One stubborn farmer even tore down an entire wall so he could rebuild it as a double-thick barrier packed with sawdust. Elias never claimed ownership over the idea. If anything, he seemed mildly embarrassed by the attention. When someone praised his engineering, he'd simply say, "It's just nature doing what nature does. I only gave it the room." But his philosophy spread further than he realized. A blacksmith in a neighboring valley built a water bench in his forge to keep the workspace from freezing overnight. A family traveling west borrowed Elias's birch bark drawings and built a modified version of his wall columns in a snowbound cabin near Lolo Pass. Even trappers passing through heard the story of the man who filled his walls with winter sun and carried versions of the tale into Idaho and Wyoming. Frontier knowledge never traveled neatly. It drifted in stories, in sketches traded for a cup of coffee, in rumors that grew or shrank, depending on who told them. Some said Elias had invented a magical wall that stayed warm on its own. Others said he'd built the cabin so tight, even the cold couldn't find a way inside. None told it exactly right, but all carried a piece of the truth. And that was enough. Because by the time Elias grew older, hair-silvering steps slowing his ideas had mingled with the countless small innovations that shaped frontier life. Men no longer laughed at the thought of thermal mass or thick insulation. Many cabins across the territory used some form of his method, even if they didn't know where it came from. When Elias finally passed in the quiet of an early spring morning decades later, his cabin remained standing, weathered but warm inside, still holding traces of heat, long after the fire died. The structure outlived him by many years, eventually dismantled when new owners built a larger homestead. Yet even when the last log came down, the lessons he left behind remained. Fjordhufker, heat can be saved, not just made. Winter can be managed, not merely endured. And a single man's careful observation can ripple outward across a frontier. His cabin may have been taken apart one timber at a time, but its legacy lived on in the warmth of many homes and in the quiet respect that eventually replaced mockery. More than a century has passed since Elias Turner packed the walls of his cabin with water and sunlight, but the principles he relied on haven't grown old. In fact, they've become the backbone of some of the most advanced off-grid and energy-efficient homes built today. The world simply gave new names to things Elias already understood. In modern architecture, the idea is called thermal mass, the ability of dense materials to store warmth and release it slowly over time. Many green homes now use concrete floors, stone interior walls, or thick adobe structures to capture heat during the day. And in cold climates, off-grid homesteaders place metal tanks or large IBC totes filled with water along the south side of their houses for the exact same reason Elias built his columns. Engineers even developed something known as a tromba wall, a sun-facing wall filled with thermal material warmed through glass, then allowed to bleed heat inward through the night. Modern builders credit French scientists for the invention. Frontier folk might smile to know a quiet mountain man had already done it with his own hands in 1836. Solar water heaters, radiant floor systems, and passive solar homes all use versions of Elias's thinking: gather warmth when the world gives it, freely store it in mass, and let nature do the rest. Even the thermal bench in his cabin has a modern cousin. In Scandinavian countries, heated masonry benches called kachelofin, or heat retainers, keep homes warm for hours after the stove burns out. The idea is identical: build, mass charge it with heat. Enjoy the steady warmth long after the fire dies. But perhaps the most striking modern echo of Elias's design is found among off-grid households. Many fill black painted water tanks along south walls of barn sheds or greenhouses to stabilize temperature swings. Some do it knowingly, quoting physics textbooks. Others simply say granddad did it and it worked. Most never realize they're repeating the same principle a lone frontier carpenter pieced together from observation instinct and 2 decades of winter hardship. And maybe that's the point. Good ideas don't need to be famous. They don't need to be credited. They simply need to work. The quiet genius of Elias Turner lives not in textbooks, but in every homestead that stays warm without wasting fuel, in every cabin that holds its heat through the night, and in every moment someone chooses understanding over brute force. A warm home, whether in 1836 or today, is built not from luck or comfort, but from wisdom that the modern world has begun to rediscover one cold season at a time. In the end, the valley remembered Elias Turner, not for his traps, nor his carpentry, nor the countless winters he weathered alone. They remembered him for the thing they once mocked the loudest: his willingness to think differently, to trust the quiet logic of nature over the louder voices of tradition. The same men who chuckled as he hauled water into his walls now told newcomers about the smartest cabin Montana ever saw. They pointed to the south-facing slope, where it once stood long gone now, and spoke of the winter Elias stayed warm, while everyone else battled the cold hour by hour. Some said he was ahead of his time. Others said he simply paid better attention. Both were true. Elias never boasted about what he'd built. When neighbors praised him, he'd smile faintly and say, "Winter's just a puzzle. Most folks fight it. I only learned to listen." To him, the warmth inside that cabin wasn't a triumph over the frontier, but it was cooperation with it. He understood that survival didn't come from brute strength, but from aligning oneself with the laws that shape the land. And that might be the greatest lesson he left behind. Because long after his cabin was dismantled, long after his drawings faded and his tools rusted, the idea he carried still lived on. Every home that holds heat, every greenhouse warmed by water barrels, every off-grid cabin built with purpose instead of panic. All of them echo the quiet wisdom of a man who refused to let winter dictate his life. His story reminds us that innovation often looks foolish at first glance, that sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is simply the one paying closest attention, and that the frontier was shaped not just by muscle and grit, but by the deep thinking souls who saw possibility where others saw problems. Elias Turner didn't chase glory. He didn't seek to change the world. He only wanted to build a home that kept him warm. But in doing so, he ended up building something bigger, a legacy of understanding, a testament to thoughtful survival, and a reminder that real wisdom often comes wrapped in silence. And so the story endures, carried from cabin to cabin, winter after winter, the man they laughed at. The cabin that stayed warm, and the simple truth that turned mockery into admiration. A truth as old as the mountains themselves. Heat stored is heat earned. And a mind that listens is a mind that survives.